Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another event sponsored by Barbados Overseas Community and Friends Association. Today we are honored to have as our guest the author, Barbadian author, Kandace Chimbiri, and she will have an interesting conversation, as it says in the blurb, with Marilyn Devonish. Now, I just want to say a bit about our Marilyn. She's our remote queen, and just to put that into context, during COVID, when we all was in that confused state, and we had nowhere to go, and we took to the Zoom platform, and Marilyn Devonish became the darling of the community, which she did so many events. It's also when I started to learn Zoom, and I think you've been around us for the last 15 years, doing events from the independence panel discussion and so. So my job here is just to introduce Marilyn, because this is Kandace's day, and Marilyn will then introduce Kandace. So everyone, give him a round of applause, please.
Thank you. Hi, Liz.
Thank you all for being here today. Wonderful to have you join us. So before we begin, as is customary, I will introduce you to our fantastic author. And the first thing I'm going to say, because this year's Black History Month, for those of you who are watching this in real time, it's about reclaiming the narrative. And one of the first things that struck me was your name, because your name looks like it could be Kandace. And then when I actually went and listened to you, it's Kandace. And oftentimes people won't correct people when they say the name incorrectly. They just kind of carry on. And I remember years ago, there's a comedian called Gina Yashere, and she was saying to her mum, they can't pronounce my name, they can't pronounce my name. And her mum said, look, if they can pronounce Tchaikovsky, they can learn to pronounce your name. So I will always say to people, if your name is somewhat unusual in the way that it may be pronounced, in terms of reclaiming the narrative, because our names are important, somebody decided that is what they wanted to call us as we walk through this earth, I would say, make sure you correct them and teach them how to say it. So I've written here, CAN-DA-SE, because I'm like, I need to get that into my head because the spelling denotes something else. So let me tell you about Kandace. We will introduce to you our fantastic author, Kandace Chimbiri. So let me give you a little bit of background and overview for those who may not yet have had the pleasure of meeting her. She is the author of Britain's Black Nurses, which is the book we are here to talk about today, but there are so many others as well. You can see some of them here on the table before us. She's a children's author and speaker with a fervent passion for Black history, and it's one of the things that drives her. Her non-fiction writing, which is based on true life stories and events from Black history, is a testament to her dedication and love for the subject of Black history. Born in Greenwich in London, raised in nearby Lewisham with her sister, her parents were born in Barbados, and they came over in what we now know to be the Windrush period. And she says her parents both instilled a sense of pride and a lifelong love of books and reading. Her parents were part of the African Caribbean settlers, and in the 1980s, they returned to Barbados, where Kandace attended secondary school before returning to London. As an adult, she was deeply affected by the stark absence of diverse voices in children's literature, and the few books about Black history that were available only scratched the surface in terms of the richness and complexity of the stories that we have to tell. So this realization fueled her determination to fill the void with her work. And today, we are going to be speaking about another of those wonderful books that fills the void. So Kandace, welcome and hello, a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming.
And so I guess the first question, in terms of the writing and filling the void, In terms of how you're introduced, is there anything else that comes to mind that, first of all, you want our viewing public, both the audience here and those watching online, is there anything else we should know about you before you begin this conversation?
No. You covered it very thoroughly. I was listening and thinking, I actually forgot all those things about myself. So you started saying them. No, you've covered it well.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I guess my first question, in terms of all of the things that you could have written about, because like you said, it's a rich, diverse tapestry, so many stories that haven't been told, why nursing?
So I actually started as a self-publisher, and I always chose my own topics. And then in 2020, I got a book deal with Scholastic to do 5 books. So the books that I've done have been a combination of ones I wanted to do, and this particular one was actually suggested by them. They said, would you like to write a book about nurses? And I thought, yeah, definitely. A book about the story of Britain's black nurses. And then after I agreed to it and I started it, I thought, I had no idea it was going to be the hardest book I have ever written. Of all my books, this was the hardest one to research.
Why was it the hardest one to research? Given that nurses are so prolific, they seem to be everywhere, and that's what a lot of the black women were known for.
Yeah, and that's what I was quite surprised about when I started, because obviously I agreed. I said, yeah, I'll do a book about Britain's black nurses. And I know that people have probably heard of Mary Seacole, right? Yeah, and I think people also know about the Windrush generation nurses, people that came from the Caribbean, especially in the 50s and 60s onwards. But I knew that there must be more to the story than that. But when I started to do the research, I realized that nursing history as a whole, not just black nurses, but nursing history as a whole is very poorly recorded. Because nursing is associated with women, that's also poorly recorded. And then there's black history. So it's all those 3 things coming together. And then because Britain had an empire, and because many of the nurses, they either came or their origins were from places outside of Britain, it meant that you had to look at about 30 different countries, because it's all of Africa, it's all of the Caribbean. And as I always point out, Canada as well. People forget that Canada was a part of the British Empire as well. And so it's so many different places, and those are all places that have very different histories. And they also have very different recordings. So some places, the archives have more. Some places, the archives have very little or nothing. So when people look at the cover of the book, they think, oh, it's going to be about modern nurses. But I wanted to actually go back and see how far can we go back, because we know that people have looked after people from the beginning of humanity, and I wanted to see how far back could we go in telling the history of black sick nursing, and that's all that made it quite challenging.
Interesting, and I have to say, one of the things that surprised me today when I was looking through the book was seeing the Egyptians, the piece about the mummification, and the piece about the herbs, because people often talk to me about alternative medicine. If I might suggest something, they go, oh, alternative, and I say, let me stop you right there. As far as I am concerned, it's the original medicine. And we're just scratching the surface, and I think so much has been lost, and that's where you kind of start with this book. So can you please tell us a little bit about that side of thing, and the herbs and the natural medicine?
Well, it's definitely only a little bit, because there's a lot we don't know. In fact, we know very, very little, but I wanted to put in what we did know. Even if it isn't a lot, I still felt it was important to start the book in that time. So we know, for example, the ancient Egyptians, they kept very good records. So we know that the oldest texts in medical history are right here in London from ancient Egypt, the Kahun papyrus. Because one of the things that I did when I started doing my journey as a self-published author, I would do tours and go to museums and archives and galleries and find out all this information. And I do tours, I still do them on a private basis, of a museum called the Petrie Museum. Has anybody heard of that museum? No? The museum is close to the British Museum. It has 80,000 objects from Egypt and the Sudan. So it's one of the top 5 museums collections from Egypt, and hardly anybody knows it's there.
Wow.
And so about 20 years ago, when I started to learn all of this information, I would go to those places in my spare time and try and look at information. So they actually have a papyrus there called the Kahun Papyrus, which is the oldest medical text in the whole world.
Wow.
It's from ancient Egypt. So we know obviously we know that ancient Egyptians understood bodies. We know that they did mummification. Obviously there's the bandaging and things like that. But there's a lot we don't know. We don't know how they trained doctors. We don't know how they arranged their healthcare. We don't know if they had hospitals. So there's a lot we don't know. But at least what we did know, I wanted to put that in. And also we know that in West Africa there was knowledge as well, because it was recorded by the enslavers who kept some of the enslaved people on the West African coast to look after people before they shipped over to places like Barbados. So that information is actually there. So there were healers, there was some knowledge of helping, nursing, caring for. I wanted to put that in.
And in terms of researching this topic and looking at the story of Britain's black nurses, is there anything in that research that really surprised you? Because it looks like there's a lot. So what really surprised you as you were kind of getting to grips with this topic?
I suppose I was surprised about the lack of recording of information. I was also quite surprised that there was obviously this tradition from Africa, this knowledge, and I was quite surprised that during the enslavement period, the enslavers benefited from it. So there are actually records of people. They might have been, say, colonial people, maybe naval officers, military officers. They would actually go to the black nurses, doctresses, nurses stroke, rather than going to the white doctors. So they were better, and they knew that. Yet it wasn't recorded. We do not seem to have any evidence of how they did the treatments. We just have the names of some of these people, like Mary Seacole's mother, Rebecca Grant. She was one of that tradition. There was a lady, Cuba Cornwallis, who actually helped Horatio Nelson. So there are all these women who obviously have these skills, and they're going to them, but yet it's not being institutionalized. It's just strange. So things like that, it's quite hard to understand how people could have thought, because you would think if those people had knowledge and you're going to them above your own, that you would record more about them, but that didn't happen.
That is fascinating, because we were oftentimes, I know when I was growing up in history, I was around in the days of Alvin Ailey, Roots, etc. So I always felt as though we were portrayed as less than, with absolutely no skills, no knowledge. And you're almost saying the complete opposite as you're getting in to look at this particular topic.
Yeah. Surprise, yeah.
Well, maybe not for some. They'll be like, well, that's no surprise.
Yeah.
And in terms of the story of some of the nurses, is there anything in terms of the research and even conversations you had with modern day nurses, anything you wanted to share about some of the kind of key themes, messages, narratives that were coming through?
So one of the things that I did notice in writing the book, because the book is what I would call a kind of a framework book, so it's not delving too much into individual stories. It's more a book where you can read it and get an overview of the history of nursing, and then as you learn more about individual nurses, you can think, that one goes in this part of the story, that one goes in this bit of history, that one goes in here. But one of the trends that I did notice was that before the Second World War, the nurses, black nurses that came to Britain, pretty much had to come under their own expenses. They were women, like Mary Seacole, who were in a position to find enough money to come to Britain for various reasons. And largely, they were expected to go back. It isn't until you get to the Second World War, and then obviously the NHS being formed, that the nurses are now being asked to come and stay and help. So that was quite interesting seeing, because what I try to do is look at more of the broad trends. So I find now when we look at books for children, history books for children, it's quite popular to get books that are biographies, like, little books about individual people. And I think that's good, but I think that sometimes with those books you are not always realizing that those people are very, very exceptional. And I'm also fascinated by the ordinary people as well as the extraordinary, exceptional people. Yeah.
Wonderful. And generally speaking, what is your writing process? How do you go from the suggestion, what about a book for nurses, to the finished product that we have in our hand? Is it the same for every book you write, or is it slightly different each time?
So I have been writing like this since 2009, and I have been asked that question before, and I've always said, don't ever ask me that question, because I don't know what my process is. But actually, funny enough, over the last year, I have actually worked out what my process is, what I do, and I realized that when I follow that process, it works, and on the times when I haven't followed it, I had more difficulty. So for me, the way that I work is I think of the title first, because with non-fiction, especially with things like this, so for example, medicine, in London, there are 25 different museums and collections about medicine alone. You can go into the history of doctors, the history of surgeons, the history of nurses, apothecaries, if I pronounce that correctly, people do, medicine, pharmacy. There's all these different areas. And when you start doing research, especially with something like nursing, where it wasn't until 1860 or so that it became a profession, you're going to find that nursing is going into all these different things. It's like a doctor could be a bit of a doctor, a bit of a surgeon, you could do a bit of mixing up the medicines himself, they did all these different things. So once I get the title, then I will work out the chapters, what I think I'm going to be doing, and then that helps me start the research, because you don't know until you start the research what you're going to find. So for example, with this book that I did about the airmen, this one I did have a lot of difficulty with, because when I started, I thought I was going to be writing just about the Second World War. Then I started doing research, and I found out that there were airmen during the First World War as well, which I didn't expect. So you kind of have to adjust it a bit. But I've realized now that that's the best process for me. And so if, for example, someone wants to change the title, which I've had before, now I know I will have to rethink things instead of just agreeing and say, yes, I'm going to do it. And then I end up in a real state because it doesn't work with the process, how I do it. Yeah, that information is actually there. So there were healers, there was some knowledge of helping, nursing, caring for. I wanted to put that in.
And in terms of researching this topic and looking at the story of Britain's black nurses, is there anything in that research that really surprised you? Because it looks like there's a lot. So what really surprised you as you were kind of getting to grips with this topic?
I suppose I was surprised about the lack of recording of information. I was also quite surprised that there was obviously this tradition from Africa, this knowledge, and I was quite surprised that during the enslavement period, the enslavers benefited from it. So there are actually records of people, they might have been, say, colonial people, maybe naval officers, military officers. They would actually go to the black nurses, doctresses, nurses stroke, rather than going to the white doctors. So they were better, and they knew that. Yet it wasn't recorded. We did not seem to have any evidence of how they did the treatments. We just have the names of some of these people, like Mary Seacole's mother, Rebecca Grant. She was one of that tradition. There was a lady, Cuba Cornwallis, who actually helped Horatio Nelson. So there are all these women who obviously have these skills, and they're going to them, but yet it's not being institutionalized. It's just strange. So things like that, it's quite hard to understand how people could have thought, because you would think if those people had knowledge and you're going to them above your own, that you would record more about them, but that didn't happen.
That is fascinating, because we were oftentimes, I know when I was growing up in history, I was around in the days of Alvin Ailey, Roots, etc., so I always felt as though we were portrayed as less than, with absolutely no skills, no knowledge, and you're almost saying the complete opposite as you're getting in to look at this particular topic.
Yeah. Surprise, yeah.
Well, maybe not for some. They'll be like, well, that's no surprise.
Yeah.
And in terms of the story of some of the nurses, is there anything in terms of the research and even conversations you had with modern day nurses, anything you wanted to share about some of the kind of key themes, messages, narratives that were coming through?
So one of the things that I did notice in writing the book, because the book is what I would call a kind of a framework book, so it's not delving too much into individual stories. It's more a book where you can read it and get an overview of the history of nursing, and then as you learn more about individual nurses, you can think, that one goes in this part of the story, that one goes in this bit of history, that one goes in here. But one of the trends that I did notice was that before the Second World War, the nurses, black nurses that came to Britain, pretty much had to come under their own expenses. They were women, like Mary Seacole, who were in a position to find enough money to come to Britain for various reasons. And largely, they were expected to go back. It isn't until you get to the Second World War, and then obviously the NHS being formed, that the nurses are now being asked to come and stay and help. So that was quite interesting seeing, because what I try to do is look at more of the broad trends. So I find now when we look at books for children, history books for children, it's quite popular to get books that are biographies, like, little books about individual people. And I think that's good, but I think that sometimes with those books, you are not always realizing that those people are very, very exceptional. And I'm also fascinated by the ordinary people as well as the extraordinary, exceptional people. Yeah.
Wonderful. And generally speaking, what is your writing process? How do you go from the suggestion, what about a book for nurses, to the finished product that we have in our hand? Is it the same for every book you write, or is it slightly different each time?
So I have been writing like this since 2009. And I have been asked that question before, and I've always said, don't ever ask me that question, because I don't know what my process is. But actually, funny enough, over the last year, I have actually worked out what my process is, what I do, and I realized that when I follow that process, it works, and on the times when I haven't followed it, I had more difficulty. So for me, the way that I work is I think of the title first, because with non-fiction, especially with things like this. So for example, medicine. In London, there are 25 different museums and collections about medicine alone. You can go into the history of doctors, the history of surgeons, the history of nurses, apothecaries, if I pronounce that correctly, people do, medicine, pharmacy. There's all these different areas. And when you start doing research, especially with something like nursing, where it wasn't until 1860 or so that it became a profession, you're going to find that nursing is going into all these different things. It's like a doctor could be a bit of a doctor, a bit of a surgeon, you could do a bit of mixing up the medicines himself, they did all these different things. So once I get the title, then I will work out the chapters, what I think I'm going to be doing, and then that helps me start the research, because you don't know until you start the research what you're going to find. So, for example, with this book that I did about the airmen, this one I did have a lot of difficulty with, because when I started, I thought I was going to be writing just about the Second World War. Then I started doing research, and I found out that there were airmen during the First World War as well, which I didn't expect. So you kind of have to adjust it a bit. But I've realized now that that's the best process for me. And so if, for example, someone wants to change the title, which I've had before, now I know I will have to rethink things instead of just agreeing and say, yes, I'm going to do it. And then I end up in a real state because it doesn't work with the process, how I do it, yeah.
It's going to sound a bit esoteric, but in terms of the people that you've searched, if they're almost like speaking through you, what do you think they would want to say to us? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So... Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You need one of those clip things that goes...
Do I've actually got one of those at home.
You should have brought it.
So we've got your process. Thank you for sharing that. Because I've got friends who they just carry little notebooks, and every time they get an idea, it goes in the notebook. I've got others who are very regimented, like from this time to this time, they're just going to sit at their desk, even if they don't write or type anything. So it's always interesting to hear about people's process. What's the easiest part of writing for you?
The easiest part is saying, oh, I'm going to write a book and starting. Because you always feel enthusiastic at the beginning, and then, because you've got the idea, and like you said, you've got friends that sometimes will carry around a book and write ideas down, and I do that as well, because ideas are actually really easy. It's not getting the idea, it's actually being able to carry the idea through the beginning, through the middle, and to the end. That's, the easiest part is just the idea, to be honest.
And what's the most challenging part for you?
Finishing the book. Actually getting it finished. I think with this sort of writing, you have to be very, very organized, and it's quite hard sometimes. So even with this book, because I'm not a nurse, and like I said, there are all these different areas that people sort of did. They were called nurses or doctoresses, some of them at some points. And then a doctor might do some things that we'd more associate now with a nurse. So it's quite hard actually to decide which are the nursing elements and which aren't. And I wanted to make sure it was a book that nurses could read and understand about nursing. I didn't want to sort of cheat and put in things that weren't really nursing. I wanted them to be able to understand a history of nursing. So I think that was quite challenging, doing that. And also because some of the, a lot of the people in the past who didn't write, and because I didn't want to just start the book in modern times, I really wanted to go back as far as possible. And that obviously was quite hard with this particular book as well,
And how do you know you're done? I mean, of course, your publisher might give you a deadline and say, you're finished on Friday, so therefore you're finished on Friday. But for you, how do you know that you're satisfied? Because I felt that this book has another piece to be told in terms of the story. So how do you know when you're done?
What other piece did you think? That's interesting.
Because, it's going to sound weird, but now you've asked, I kept thinking about page 97 of the book on the way here, but there is no page 97. And then on the train, I was like, I don't actually know if page 97 is it, but there's something that comes after the book. But then I thought, well, when I get here, I'm going to look at the book and I'm going to see what's on page 97. First thing I realized, it isn't. And I was like, I think that's why it was beyond the book. So it felt for me, even without having opened the covers, that there's going to be another, like a sequel to this story.
So, as I mentioned, when I do the books, and all of them, but this one we're talking about, is what I call, as I said, a framework book. So I do feel that there is more to the book, but not necessarily to be written by me, because very much I feel that a teacher or a parent or anyone should be able to look at the book, look at the contents, and each of these contents is a project in itself or further research in itself. So I think with this sort of writing, when you decide what you're going to write about, you do your chapters, and that's what you have to do. You will always find more things. There will always be more things you can put in. There can always be more. But at some point, you just have to basically stop. And that's really it. And I decided to stop on chapter 14, A Brighter Future. So I knew once I got up to the story between the 1950s up to roughly today, I felt that was where I wanted to stop, and then just have a chapter on the future so people could think about what can we do to carry this story forward, to learn this, and write the next chapter ourselves.
Okay, I love that. So for those who haven't yet read the book, how would you describe the book? What are some of the things you want to share in terms of why would people want to pick this up, and what are some of the things they're going to discover between the covers of this book?
Well, hopefully they will learn about things that they didn't know before. Hopefully they will understand a bit more about Mary Seacole's story. So Mary Seacole in context, like I mentioned, that she was obviously extraordinary and exceptional with what she did, and we need to know that. But also to understand that she came from a tradition and that there were other people around who also were part of that tradition. So I think that was quite important. I think also, and this was one of the things that I perhaps hadn't realized, why are people like Mary Seacole much better known? And it's because we seem to have a tendency to appreciate nurses when they help during times of crisis. So Mary Seacole, she was obviously during the Crimean War, so the country was at war, as was Florence Nightingale. And when you have a war or epidemic or a pandemic, everyone turns, oh, we're our nurses, oh, we love our nurses. And then after the crisis is finished, they forget. So I think what I'd like is for this book to be in schools particularly, and for us to be able to use it to appreciate nurses all the time, not just during a time of crisis. And there is an education consultancy who like the book, and they've produced a free resource which is available, and it can be used actually from this week for all children Key Stage 2. Every teacher can use it, so that we can be appreciating nurses all the time, not just when we need them. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I remember years ago, Tyrone organised an event with a group of nurses for Black History Month. It was at London Transport, and there was someone called May Tanner who was there. And they shared and recounted some of the stories, what it was like for them working in the NHS in the early days, and it was nothing short of shocking. It's still to this day, and it must have been, I don't know, a good 10 years ago, something like that maybe, and I still remember to this day some of the stories that they told us in this room about the language that was used and the things that was said, and they're trying to help someone and the abuse that was coming back to them. So in terms of some of these stories, is there anything in particular that stands out, any story that is almost seared into your mind that you came across as you were writing the book?
Yes, for me, obviously there are a lot of nurses, and I didn't go into detail on all of them. It's more of an overview. So what you've just spoken about is obviously mentioned here, that the nurses often had to deal with discrimination from parents and so on. But it's a summary, it's not individual stories. But when you hear a story like that, you can then think, oh, that goes into this part of it. But for me, the person that is seared into my mind most is a lady called Sarah Woodbine, who came from Argentina during the late Victorian period. And she came because she wanted to learn nursing and then go back to help her own people with nursing. But there was a publication called the Nursing Record and Hospital World, and they ran an article on the 8th of October 1898, that's in my brain, called A Plea for Equality, because she seemed to be a very friendly person. She came top in her exams, yet she couldn't get a position of responsibility which she needed. And she said, and the article said, that she said it was because of what they called then colour prejudice. So the article was a plea for equality, and that's going back all of that time. And she only wanted to learn nursing to go and help other people. So, yeah.
And some would say the plea for equality still exists in today's world. Not quite as overt as it was back then, but there we still have the undercurrent.
Yes, yeah. And I think hopefully from a book like this you can understand then the history, because the way that nursing was set up, as I explained, was to benefit white middle-class women, and they were the ones who were expected to go out to the colonies and to do the nursing, and particularly most of the time, to be the matrons and the senior nurses. But even in some places, even the ordinary nurses had to be white. So, for example, in Bermuda, in their hospital, all the nurses had to be white. Black nurses weren't allowed. Black patients could go in, but the nurses were only white nurses. So once you begin to get all of that, and I think as well, obviously we are here in a situation where it's mostly Barbadian people, but that's why I like to write my books like this, because I think when you only look at what happened in your individual colony, now ex-colony, but colony, you see the picture, but it's a narrower picture. When you look wider, then you can see the patterns. You can see some differences as well, because in Barbados they did have black nurses in the Barbados General Hospital, as it was called, but in other places they didn't. But even in Barbados, the senior nurses, they're coming from Britain. It's all part of a colonial project, and nursing is a part of that.
So interesting.
I learned a lot when I was writing this book.
It would seem so. And also, because you write children's books, which is amazing and fantastic, in our digital world, where most people have one of these in their hand as opposed to one of these, unless it's on the curriculum, what would you say about getting books into the hands of children that are not on the official curriculum, that they don't have to read, this is extracurricular study. What would you say about continuing that trend and ensuring that the next generation grow up with the same love of books that you had growing up? How do we instill that?
Well, as you said, it really is a challenge. I'm not going to lie, it's a challenge because, as you said, we've all got phones and, you know, all our smart devices and things that are grabbing our attention. And you do need attention to sit down and read a book. But I try to make the books, for the most part, small, so that they're easy to read. They're not complex language. I'm never going to win a prize for writing like War and Peace or some book where people are going to say, oh, isn't the nouns that she uses so wonderful? You know, I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to write simply. But I'm also trying not to talk down to the children, but trying to give them the information. And I think a lot of children do still like reading books. They do still like information. And I think one of the advantages, I think, of doing Black history is you're actually coming with things that people aren't expecting. So people are, like I said, they look at this book and they think it's going to be about the Windrush nurses. Then they pick it up and they say, oh, it's got information about Egypt, it's got this, it's got that. You know, colourful illustrations. I think that helps. With this book, The Story of Afro Hair, this one is really being read by a lot of children. And I meet children all the time who tell me, oh, miss, I've read that book twice. And I was really nervous when I wrote this book because, again, you don't know how people are going to respond. But it's the topic. It's Black history, but it's told through hairstyles. So people are usually interested in hair. So it's trying to think of ways that we can still engage them and make the book, you know, attractive and eye-catching. And yeah, so we still have to keep trying, but there is a lot of competition from other books as well as from devices. But we have to do it because literacy, being able to read, be able to understand how information is arranged is so important. And with AI and the internet, if we don't get children understanding how books are put together, how to look at information, it's going to be a problem in the future.
Absolutely, and your books are absolutely beautiful. Well, the first thing, there was, when I was growing up at school, we had these, there was called the Ladybird series,
yes.
and you know, various books that centered around children, and they felt they were this sort of size,
yes.
and this sort of, you know, in terms of number of pages, and immediately you feel like, I could read that.
Well, it's funny you say that because this book, The Windrush, this is my last self-published book. So I self-published this one, and it was quite popular. And then this is the first one in traditional publishing deals. So when I got the 5-book deal, one of my conditions was that they had to republish this. And when I did this, so originally, as I said, it was a self-published book. And I also used to have like the little Ladybird books. So when I was thinking about how I was going to make this book, I was thinking, okay, so I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and there wasn't a story about the Windrush, even though it happened in 1948. And so why I wanted to make it with this style was because I felt that I was kind of correcting what had been missing. And so the Ladybird books were actually part of my inspiration for the style of the book. Yeah.
Wonderful, because that's exactly what it reminded me of. When I got it picked up, so I was like, oh, it's like the Ladybird book style. I love that.
Yeah.
And just for those of you who may be watching this, you haven't yet seen the book, I'm just going to very quickly go through the chapters because it was fascinating. Like you said, I wasn't expecting this when I opened the book. So chapter 1, Ancient and Medieval Africa. Chapter 2, Europe comes to Africa. Chapter 3, Caring During Enslavement. Chapter 4, Creating a New World. Chapter 5, Enslaved Nurses. Chapter 6, The Story of Kuba Cornwallis. Chapter 7, The Story of Mary Seacole. Chapter 8, Mary Goes to Crimea. Chapter 9, Nursing in Victorian Britain. Chapter 10, New Style Nurses Go Abroad. Chapter 11, A Colonial World. Chapter 12, Black Nurses in Britain Before the 1950s. Chapter 13, Black Nurses in Britain After the 1950s. And then the closing chapter, Chapter 14, A Brighter Future. And then we've got the glossary, bibliography, picture quotations, acknowledgements, and index. But I wasn't expecting that when I opened this book. And I'm like, it's a smorgasbord of history. Is there one of these that is your favorite chapter?
No.
You like them all
I
equally?
love them all. I love them all. Because each one is sort of could even be a little book in and of
Yeah.
itself, you know. As you said, it's like a whole mixture of all different histories joined together. So, yeah, I like them all.
Absolutely. And one of the things that when I was looking through this, I was like, oh, that's interesting, actually. You sort of touched on it earlier about nurses being kept back to care for their enslavers.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that's very interesting. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, that's all that I really know. And there were some records, and they did mention that, for example, in the 1700s, because, you know, the slavers were obviously working for, like, the Royal African Company and so on. So they would be sending reports back to the Britain, and they did mention about the fact that some of these healers could get very good results with their knowledge and the knowledge of plants and herbs. So there is that. And also during enslavement, some of the people who would have had these knowledge and skills, that would have been something they could use to get better privileges. You know, for example, if they were on the plantation and so on. So, you know, there is evidence of it there. It's just actually people finding it and putting it into books.
And there was something else you were saying also about the fact that the herbs they would have been using traditionally were not the same as the herbs they were encountering here.
Yeah.
And then there's that, well, how did they make the shift and the jump to be able to do that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think obviously in the New World, there were people who were there before, so some of that knowledge would have been there. Yeah. And also they would have been trying to look after themselves as best they could under those conditions, and they would observe what was working. So there's also further observation and experience actually going on there, and that's sort of what I tried to portray in there's a map that I put in, which I call the washing machine, where I'm trying to give the children the idea. We look at colonies, we tend to say, oh, they got sugar, they got, you know, cotton. We're looking at material things. We are less looking or trying to explain about non-material things, which are obviously harder to measure, but they're also skills. So people are coming from Africa, that's a one-way journey, and they are bringing skills and knowledge. And then there are obviously people who are already there, and then there are people who are coming from Europe, but they're going back and forth. Letters are going back and forth. And so it's here that some of this knowledge and skills will be passed around, even though we don't really point that out or acknowledge it. But you also have to recognize that this was a very traumatic time in history, and there are going to be a lot of people who had knowledge who will not have survived this journey or survived this experience. And then there are also going to be people who are not going to be valued for having this knowledge, not have the opportunity to use it because they're being brought under conditions to work, to help on, you know, to work on plantations for other people, not to use that knowledge that they might have. So we don't really know how much we've actually lost.
Wow, I feel a book on herbs coming on.
Not by me, someone else. Hopefully it will inspire someone else to do that.
Absolutely, and I think that's the thing, it can really kind of inspire you. So in terms of, one of the things I was thinking about is you are I think people like yourself, they're wisdom keepers. You know, you're collecting the wisdom because you've also mentioned you go around to museums and you help to curate things, and that's a really important role. So if you were thinking about some of the people who have been significant in Black history, who have now passed on, if you had an opportunity to sit down with someone who has passed, who has been significant in Black history, and they don't have to have come from Barbados or even the UK, who would you choose to sit down with, and why would you choose that person, and what would you want to say to them or get from them?
That is such a hard question because there are actually so many people. It's hard to pick one person. But also, I'd be a bit afraid because like I said, when we think of these heroes, they were people. So some of them might have actually had really bad habits or things that you don't really know if you really want to know. You know, I think we always think that people who have done these outstanding things, I think we always think that they are better than everybody else. But sometimes I think they are just like everybody else, just that they decided to do something. And I don't know if I would always want to meet them because, I would be curious because especially going back further in history, it'd be interesting to know how did they speak? Do they have an accent? They're obviously things you want to know. But then I kind of feel maybe I might then not admire them so much if I actually met them. But it is quite hard to choose because there are quite a lot. There are quite a lot of people. I suppose for me, I'd be most curious about people from ancient history. And there's a particular civilization that I love, the one that I did my very first book about, Step Back in Time to Ancient Kush, which is a place in the Sudan. And at one time, some of these actually ruled Egypt as well. So there are a few people who were rulers there who I'd like to know a bit more about, like Pharaoh Taharko, and there's a queen called Queen Amani Reines, who fought the Romans, and people don't know that story. So maybe they would be the ones if I had to choose.
Okay.
But it'd be hard to choose, it'd be hard.
Absolutely, I hear you. And I'm always curious about the Egyptians. How did they build those pyramids?
Yes.
Their precision some of the things we could not recreate those today.
Yeah.
So I'm always really, really curious about that. So one of the things you look at is diversity and inclusion and equality. So when you think about the role of books, what role would you say books play in that part of the narrative and that part of the wider conversation?
So I think traditionally people haven't really given a lot of credit to people of African descent and their contributions. So I feel that these books can help to address that. And one of the things, I have been asked recently about how to use the books, and I think that Black History Month is a really good opportunity because it's a focus and it's an anniversary. So certainly they can be used to do projects and displays, whether it's in a library, a school, homes during Black History Month, but then also they can be used at other times of the year as well. So, for example, I've been suggesting that, let's say you're in a school and you want to do something about maybe the history of nursing, and it's May, which is when you have International Nurses Day. So you could have like a little display, or you could do a project, and you could have books about Florence Nightingale, Mary Seacole, Edith Cavell, who's on the curriculum, and then you could have this. So you could have your Black history alongside others as well. And then when it comes to October, which is Black History Month, then you could still have this because it's about Black history, along with other books covering other topics. So I think that's one of the ways that you could sort of make it that you are doing diversity and inclusion, but also making it every day as well as being highlighted.
And this is a tricky question because I'm not going to name the celebrity, but there's someone who's very well known in the United States who says they absolutely do not agree with Black History Month. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. As somebody who writes Black history, you're educating the next generation. What are your thoughts about having a Black History Month? Has it had its day and do we just need to move on, or is it still an important part of how we impart knowledge of the past and feed that into the future?
So I think I know who the celebrity is, and everyone is entitled to their opinion, but I think, first of all, remembering history is important. So Black History Month in the UK started in 1987. And you can look online and find the story. It was actually, we credit one person, a Ghanaian guy, but he's very clear that although he had the idea, it was a cross-party initiative. He does make it clear that other people were involved as well. And the story, as it has been told, is that someone came home and said that their son said he wanted to be white. So Black History Month in this country, for sure, partly started with children at its heart, children not seeing themselves in books. And the ethos behind it is to recognize the contributions of people of African descent to world history. That need has definitely not gone away. So we definitely still need Black History Month. But like I said, you can do Black History Month. It's an anniversary. I think sometimes people forget that it is just an anniversary. It's just like Valentine's Day. You can appreciate people all year round, but you've also got the option of making a big fuss on that day. And you can actually do both. Or if you don't want to do Valentine's Day, don't do it if you think it's a rip-off. just don't do it. But many people do actually use it as an opportunity to make a fuss of their loved ones, and that's absolutely fine. There's nowhere that it says Black History Month is the only time you have to do Black history. The other thing is Black History Month should actually be about history. What tends to happen now is that a lot of people use Black History Month to talk about everything to do with black people and nothing to do with black history. And I think that is part of the problem. And at the beginning of this month, there was a report that came out that said if you look at children's books in the UK, more than half of the children's books that have a black character are not being written by black authors. So you can find that on The Guardian and the bookseller, the 3rd of October that came out. So if you are not actually really looking at doing black history and looking at who's writing this and bringing the history in, we're actually going backward. So this is why we need to keep our eye on what was the purpose of black history and are we still actually doing it.
And you make a fantastic point, because I'm now thinking about one of the events that I'm involved with, and you're absolutely right. We had something on diabetes and stroke and et cetera, We always have a Black History Month quiz, and they do take us all around history, but actually, I'm going to feed that back to the group when I go back and say, I think we've been remiss here as well, because you're absolutely correct.
Yeah, and we have to, it's good to have Black History Month events and have culture and food, but you have to still put in the history, because if you don't do that, you are still actually contributing to the idea that black people don't really have any history, or not really much. So we talked about it in 2020. 4 years later, yeah, we haven't got anything more to say. There's so much more still to do. We're only at the beginning, so we have to put the history back into Black History Month, and we have to cherish and appreciate Black History Month, and just appreciate for what it is, an anniversary.
And is there anything else you want the viewers and those people who are here with us, anything else you want them to know about this fantastic book, The Story of Britain's Black Nurses?
It took me a long time to do it. No, I think you've covered most of it. I would just say I hope it helps.
Wonderful. Yeah. So, I just want to thank you for taking the time out today to be with us here, to share the information about the book. Can you just give us a very quick overview of the other books that you have here, just if people haven't come across all of your works?
Well, this was actually the very first book that I ever did. So this was one of my self-published books that I had to spend my own money to do. And so because I didn't have a lot of money at the time, I actually did it in black and white as an activity book. But that actually worked really well, and that's about the ancient Sudan. And this book is still being sold in museums, even though it was the first one I did in 2009.
Wow.
So there's a lot of information in here that people still need to know. And then this is The Story of the Windrush, which was my last self-published book, but has now been republished. And this also has resources that are available to go alongside it that teachers can use. The Story of Afro here, we've talked about that. That's 5,000 years of black history told through popular and unpopular styles, like the jerry curl, which I once wore. So you can learn a bit of history.
You were not alone with the jerry curl, I'm sure.
And then the story of Britain's black airmen, and I think Barbadians will recognize this man on the front here. Because when I went to school in Barbados, we obviously learned about Errol Barrow, but we learned about him from independence onwards. We didn't really learn a lot about his contributions during the Second World War. And then, although I mainly write non-fiction, I have also written a couple of books that are to help children with reading. And this one, A Tale from Barbados. And so it's a fiction, it's a story, good for Halloween, but it's based on the myth of the steel donkey, which was something that happened in Barbados, in the area where I live, but many years after me. But I actually spoke to my neighbours about the steel donkey coming. And through a story.
Well, Kandace, thank you so much for your dedication to keeping Black history alive, for sharing that. Please give us a very warm round of applause for Kandace Chimbiri, our wonderful Black history author. Thank you.
Thank you. you.